Video game hype, the all-consuming, ever-growing behemoth that pushed the GTA 6 trailer to 90 million views in its first day, the tweet announcing the trailer to 2 million likes, and for my 80-year-old grandmother who watches nothing but old game show reruns to call me asking about the computer game with naked ladies in it. At this point, every AAA game comes with a preloaded overabundance of hype, but does it do more harm than good? Think about it, how many times have we been led along for years by studios who promise that one game that will change everything, only to get, whatever this is, that will be $70 please. In recent years, hype seems to have become a bit of a dirty word in the community. We've become jaded, vowing to never believe trailers and never pre-order a game again. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some different types of hype, using some notable examples to try and figure out if hype really is ruining video games. Now, in its simplest form, hype can really be boiled down to pre-release excitement for a product, and it's certainly not a new trend. For as long as video games have existed, publishers have been trying to generate interest in the product. After all, it's just marketing. For example, here's an ad for E.T. on the Atari, and we all know how that game turned out. Back in the day, publishers would try to generate interest for their games with traditional marketing campaigns consisting of TV and print media, articles and magazines, and dropping heaps of demos at us from airplanes. But at the end of the day, traditional word of mouth across playgrounds, campuses, and water coolers was still responsible for building hype for a game in the pre-digital age. This is how 1997's Final Fantasy VII became one of the most beloved games ever made, while Mortal Kombat Sub-Zero, released that same year, became the subject of 100 YouTube videos making fun of it. However, by the mid-90s, the video game industry was starting to come into its own. Game-centric publications were becoming more prevalent, allowing for interest in new games to build in the months before launch. Around that time, the first gaming websites would also launch, and the industry would get its own trade show in 1995. And shows like E3 and TGS most definitely added fuel to the burgeoning hype engine. And even though in its first couple of years, E3 was more of an industry trade show, it would quickly become synonymous with big game reveals like Metal Gear in 96 and Ocarina of Time in 97. The late 90s and early 2000s saw the widespread growth of the internet, and with it the first game forums and message boards. For the first time ever, game hype was no longer contained to your small social pocket. Millions of people could now take to the web and share their interests, speculation, and of course criticism of the newest games. Studios soon realized that they could harness this new global community and use its interest and passion for games to create what we now know as modern hype.
I'm back. You ever wonder what the bottom of an Avatar shoe looks like? Well, bam! There it is.
But not all video game hype is created even. It's now been around for long enough to split into subgenres, and the most popular of these is sequel hype. You know, the one where a studio shows off the latest installment in their cash cow AAA franchise, promising a bigger world with better graphics, more features, and absolutely no bugs at launch. Now, to be fair, there are plenty of sequels that lived up to the hype. For example, Assassin's Creed Black Flag delivered in a big way, expanding both the world and gameplay. And so the next year, after 4 stellar mainline entries, the Assassin's Creed hype train was steaming ahead. But it would only take one game to derail the entire thing. If you were involved in the community at the time, then you know the hype for Unity was huge. The first Assassin's Creed on next gen, and the first one to properly incorporate multiplayer. And then the game launches, and we learn that French people are just eyes and teeth and hair. Since then, Ubisoft has been trying to reignite the hype flames with every new entry, but their quantity over quality approach has made fans weary. Now, if there's one thing more potent than sequel hype, it's long-delayed sequel hype. And the textbook example of this is Duke Nukem Forever. Initially announced in 1997, the game would experience delay after delay, ultimately even changing development teams, and eventually becoming the video game equivalent of Chinese democracy. And just like the Guns N' Roses album, by the time Duke Nukem Forever was finally released in 2011, the 14-year wait meant that the hype had boiled over and the game had become a joke. broke. It also didn't help that the game felt outdated and very average. And that's the thing, the longer a community waits for a game, the more hype it builds. However, the trade-off is that they're going to be a lot less forgiving of the final product. So quality is key, and an example of a long-delayed sequel that actually succeeded was 2016's Doom. Just like Duke Nukem Forever, Doom 4, as it was known back then, had an excruciatingly long development cycle and had been reworked several times. But the difference came down to quality. Doom recaptured the spirit of shooters from the 90s while still feeling contemporary, unlike Duke Nukem, which kind of got it the other way around. Now, skipping ahead to modern day, at this point, Grand Theft Auto 6 finds itself in a very similar position. If this game is released in 2025, there will be a 12-year gap between it and GTA 5, which ironically enough is almost the same as the gap between the very first Grand Theft Auto and GTA 4. And while Duke Nukem Forever became more of a joke towards the end, the hype for Grand Theft Auto 6 has done nothing but grow over the years. It almost seems like GTA 6 has grown beyond a video game into this mythical entity, like the coming of video game Jesus. And many analysts believe that the game is going to sell billions even if it is rubbish, but I guess only time will tell. But sequels aren't the only things generating a huge amount of hype these days. Remakes are also a hot commodity. However, remakes are very much a double-edged sword. Remaking a beloved game comes with a lot of pre-built hype, but make too many changes or deviate too far from the original, and you risk the ire of the loyal protective fan base. And so a modern remake usually falls into one of three types. The one that updates the graphics but keeps the gameplay and story the same, like the Crash trilogy. Then you get the ones that update the graphics and gameplay but keep the story mostly the same, such as the new Resident Evil remakes. And these two are the safest ways to approach a remake, and one most studios tend to go with for a surefire way of printing money. But then you get the third type, the risky remake that also alters the story, and the Final Fantasy VII remake is a prime example of this. If there was ever a game with built-in hype, it's Final Fantasy VII. Not only have the fans been crying out for a remake for almost 2 decades, but Square themselves have been teasing one for almost as long. And in the 5-year gap between the remake's official announcement and the release, we saw the game ride an ever-growing tidal wave of hype. Finally, our beloved JRPG would be remade the way we'd imagined, down to every single detail. And then the first part comes out and you quickly realize this isn't a remake, this is more of a reboot/reimagining. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but you can understand why a section of the fandom felt bamboozled, because Square's marketing heavily pushed the remake angle when trying to build the hype of this game. However, the pushback from certain parts of the fandom didn't stop the game from selling 7 million copies. But now that the cat is out of the bag about this being more of a reimagining, it will be interesting to see if the hype for the rest of the FF7 remake series peters out or continues to grow. Now, sequels and remakes aside, every now and then a big publisher will try to launch a new property which they hope to spin off into the next big IP. And building hype for a new property is much harder than a sequel or a remake because you've got to start from scratch. There's no goodwill or reputation from previous entries to entice new customers. And this is why studios have a tendency to embellish the truth or sometimes flat out lie about what you get when the game finally comes out. And no two games exhibit this better than No Man's Sky or Cyberpunk 2077. No Man's Sky was a perfect example of showing people a bunch of cool stuff that wasn't actually in the game and then letting them build the hype for you. This was going to be the best game ever. What's that? It's delayed? Oh, that's fine. More time to make the game even better. What? The dev team is only made up of 15 people? Shut up, we've already pre-ordered it. That means it's got to be good. Unfortunately, upon release, not only was the game unfinished, it was also buggy as hell. Customers went from being promised the universe, literally, to mining space rock after space rock. No Man's Sky showed that hype was a double-edged sword. After carrying this game for years, the community went scorched earth on the developers. In the years to come, after the hype train's tremendous crash and all the rage died down, No Man's Sky would become a cautionary tale for both the developer and consumer on how expectations can blow out of proportions on a galactic scale. Of course, there would be a brighter side to the story, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about Cyberpunk 2077. Now, No Man's Sky was created by a small indie developer who kind of got carried away by the hype machine. It was their first time and they just didn't know any better. Cyberpunk was a big AAA title with a production cost of over 170 million. It was the follow-up to one of the best open-world RPGs of a generation, and developed by a studio which had won great favor from the community due to its direct, no-nonsense approach in the time of loot boxes and overpriced DLC. And yet, despite all that, Cyberpunk followed the same trajectory trajectory as No Man's Sky. We would get years of awesome footage that promised to elevate gaming to the next level, followed by a bunch of delays, and then finally the release of a broken game with many of the features missing. Cyberpunk was the latest in a slew of AAA games with inflated expectations that failed to deliver, and fans had had enough. The blowback to Cyberpunk was arguably worse than No Man's Sky or any other game before. Not only was it pulled from the PlayStation Store, CD Projekt's stock plummeted and it faced a class action lawsuit from the shareholders. Now, there have been plenty of examples of new IPs that were overhyped and underperformed, and usually the developer cuts their losses and moves on. But the reason I chose No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk was because both these games had a second chapter. Instead of taking all the pre-order cash and moving on, both developers decided to release update after update and patch after patch to fix both games and bring them closer to what was originally promised. No Man's Sky, for example, went from disaster to a critically acclaimed award-winning bestseller that added almost every feature it promised and then some. Now, to be fair, the amount of improvements and additions to Cyberpunk in the past 3 years are much smaller in scale to those of No Man's Sky, but I think most players would agree that CD Projekt Red has done enough to turn Cyberpunk into a very good open-world RPG. And so there we have it, all the different types of hype, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So, is hype enhancing or ruining video games? Well, based on the examples we've covered, it would be unfair to say that hype is all bad and no game has ever lived up to it. Strong hype can definitely help sell a game, but the one thing all these examples have in common is that the game itself has to deliver. Hype only works if there's quality behind the product. In fact, it acts as a magnifier. The bigger the hype, the higher the expectations. And look, no one is expecting publishers and developers to not promote their games.
A little bit of excitement.
But I think the consumer deserves better clarity and transparency about the end product. Video games are supposed to be fun, and the anticipation for a product, especially when part of a community, can be a big part of that fun. Which is why I think hype can be a good thing. The developers just need to be honest about what we're getting excited for. But that's just my take. Please let me know your thoughts on the current state of video game hype. What's the last game you got hyped up for, and did it live up to your expectations? As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to all my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.